welcome everybody tonight to our webinar presentation for the Greater St. Louis chapter of CSI. I'm Joel Kirsch, and I'm the chapter president this year. I wanted to pass on a couple of things that have come up here that I thought were good. The biggest one being that the board has voted to reduce the local chapter dues to $75 a year for the upcoming year. That we, with the online presence and just with, the need to encourage get some more participation and help people out, we thought that would be a good way to do it. So that'll take effect. I think that all takes effect in July, and it'll run for a calendar year from June to July, or from July to June. The other thing I did want to let everybody know that our region, we're in the North Central region, they do have a scholarship program for those who have had job changes or are no longer in a position to get their national dues reimbursed. So there's a scholarship program out there that you can apply for that will cover your national dues. So that's a nice touch. So if you need that help, you can certainly reach out to one of us through the chapter website, and we can put you in contact and pass that information on. So I think that was both good things to start the meeting off. All right, housekeeping aside, I wanted to welcome Matt Forman with Canon Design. Matt's got an interesting topic to talk about here tonight on design build delivery for healthcare. So without a whole lot else, Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So as Joel said, I'm a project manager with Canon Design. I'm an architect. I've been doing design build in one form or another for about the last 8 or 10 years. The digital background behind me is actually a bridge between 2 buildings that were built at the Central Hospital University of Montreal in Montreal, Quebec. And that was a P3 project. So that is one form of design build. And there's not a lot of biased information in here. We're just going to talk about some of the things I've learned over the years and hopefully find some good resources for all of you all while you move on through this increasing engagement with design build we're seeing in the industry. Every time you hear about design build, you hear about the advantages with cost, quality, and time. And there's definitely advantages, and if you really look at some of the material out there, you can do it well, and there's lots of people that aren't really doing it in the full spirit of design build. So we're going to talk a little bit about design build itself and how it should be executed. I'm going to reference some resources, and then the 4 learning points that George put in the agenda will address how each of those is actually achieved by the design build delivery. Collaboration is the key to a successful project delivery, and that's even if you're doing bid build, design build, IPD, whatever. The thing I like about the design build delivery is the team members each get to do what they're good at. The architects get to design, the contractors, constructors get to build, specifiers and sales reps all get to do what they're good at, and we get to deliver the best product to the owner that we can. Part of the question in design build is who is going to do what? That's actually a big question, because design build isn't what we all have been doing for the last 20, 30, 40 years with typical bid build design and construction. So one of the serious questions you need to have at the start of a design build project is the roles are different. Who is going to do what, and when are they going to do it? How does design build actually work? If you go look up the AIA, you've got the A141, the B141 for forms of contract. I'm not sure how many of you are actually aware of the Design Build Institute of America. And I took the design build, the DBIA training about 2 years ago at the start of my current project, which is the big new tower that's going on down at BJC. I'd been doing some design build before that, and I had done the IPD up in Canada, you know, been doing this and kind of collaborating with contractors. Even when I had a small firm in Clayton, we were doing a lot of stuff that was kind of design build because we do the architecture, and then the mechanical MEP guys would just kind of do their thing and get their own permit. But how do you actually codify the responsibilities of the team members on a large project where you really need to have good rules of the road? Everyone always says the best contract is the one that you sign, you put it in the drawer, and you never look at it again. Well, that works if everybody understands what they're going to be doing. The AIA A141 and B141 are actually pretty light on process and responsibilities. It says design build on the title, and it says design builder, but you could almost just take a word search in Microsoft Word and do a substitution from general contractor to design builder. And there's actually not a lot different in the AIA contract. The DBIA 540 does actually have much more process, roles, and tasks for both the designer and the constructor built into the fabric of the contract. I actually prefer that contract. People may have different opinions, but it actually gives you a better framework to have the early conversations about who's going to do what. And then there's BIM execution plans. These actually become really critical because depending on the depth of your engagement with design build, you absolutely have to understand who's going to be doing what. And in the production of the documents, the best tool for that's the BIM execution plan. So the responsibilities of team members have to be discussed. They've got to be agreed on, and they've got to be written into the contracts. I'm a firm believer in good fences make good neighbors. So as I mentioned before, I actually did the Design Build Institute of America training a couple of years ago, and they have a lot of resources. I actually have not completed my certification. I need to take my test, but the 3-day class was amazingly valuable. And they do have some resources available on their websites, and they talk about how projects should go. And I'll tell you this, when I took the Design Build Institute training, which is a 3-day training, I took it at McCarthy's office in St. Louis. They just happened to, volunteer the room for the group. Out of everybody that was in the room for the training that day, I was the only architect. And I was the only architect that hadn't switched from architecture to working for a contractor. So it was an interesting day. There were also multiple representatives of utility companies, of municipalities, and this delivery system, we're going to talk about how it goes for healthcare today, which is actually a little bit of a different beast. When you talk about design build delivery for things like roads and infrastructure projects, there's huge advantages. But when you start applying it to things like healthcare, it gets a little trickier because there's different standards and the clients have different demands within the market. So we need to talk about those roles again. The designers. What are the designers going to do in a design build delivery? Well, as usual, even in bid build, the designers are the ones setting the basis of design. We document what the owner's program is. We want the performance standards and required for the quality that they're asking us to produce. But I will qualify this. In these contracts, in a design build delivery, the prime contract is held between the contractor and the owner. So now the architect works for the contractor as part of that design build team. And that changes the dynamic. One of the fundamental things that everybody has to remember is just because the architect works for the contractor, it doesn't relieve the architect of hitting the standard of care. We still have that public safety obligation. We don't just simply sit back and wait for the contractor to tell us what to do.
First of all, if you're in a relationship with a contractor where they're asking you to do something that you're that uncomfortable with, there's a problem with your team and there's a problem with your delivery method. So everybody should be working toward the owner's best interest. That's how we should all, people say we're never going to retire on this one job. So we all have that responsibility, and it is a long-term responsibility. Specifications, because of the group I'm speaking to, I figured this was a great place to throw this in. The specifications are actually crucial to embodying the performance, the standards, and the quality that the contractors and constructors need to have as a guideline to buy out this project, because the buyout is fundamentally different in design build. And those standards have to be out there, or you're just going to get somebody coming along with any product and say, hey, I'm cheaper, use my product because it's less expensive. Well, why is it less expensive? Does it have the same performance? Does it have the same life cycle costing? Does it have the same maintenance? Those specifications actually become really crucial to controlling the quality and getting the owner, a satisfied product. So where's the role of the contractor in this? Because the contractors aren't typically engaged and providing information during the beginning of the project. And I didn't say during design, I said during the beginning of the project. The most successful design build projects, that collaboration between the contractor and the designer actually should probably start during the pursuit, very early in the project. They have to be in there to help make those decisions, but more importantly, they have to be in there to hear from the owner and from the designer what the intent of the project is. If they understand the goals and if they understand what's being asked of the design team, they should be able to help with information and engagement that can benefit the client. We've all seen that graph where, the decisions made early have the most cost benefit. The longer you wait, if you make your decision or you change your mind, it costs more money to make that change. So the procurement in a design build project is fundamentally different. You start buying out not necessarily the construction, but you start buying out the services from the trade partners. But if you can get that product information from trade partners, from manufacturers early in the design phase, you can assess if they're hitting the performance metrics, if they can meet the contract and the owner requirements, if they can be incorporated into the design. So for those of you on the call that are sales reps or putting things in specifications, that information early is so much easier to incorporate, discuss with the owner, and get approvals on. The contracts, the BIM execution plan, and even partnering engagements say how this team is going to work. What will the constructor actually do during the design phase? When is the costing and constructability feedback? And this is a really big one. Who's going to be the architect of record or the engineer of record, particularly in engineering? And all of this leads back to who's going to draw the project. So I don't know how many of you all have worked on projects that are big enough and robust enough to have a full BIM execution plan, but Revit has really kind of changed the way the industry looks at how we produce our documents. The design team isn't just drawing. When I started in this industry, it was plastic lead on Mylar. I was doing jewel tip pens on Mylar and vellum, lots of graphite on vellum. You pull the paper out of the drawer, you do your thing, run the blueprint, ship it off. As soon as the architect sends the stuff out to the bidders and the contractors, they all go to the owner and tell them the designer did it wrong. I can do it better this way. I want a substitution request for this. You're over budget. Let's all talk about value engineering. So how do we avoid that? That's where design build came from. If the architects, God forbid, don't know everything when they're designing, maybe the architect should get a little help from the contractor to implement some of that real world information before we put pencil to paper. So that collaboration going back and forth gets really important. And that's where that first bullet point up there, what does the constructor do during the design phase? The DBIA contracts, and then even the partnering agreements and how you're going to work together. When is the first time that the constructor gets a look at some drawings, gets a look at some design, and can start crunching some numbers and start looking at estimates, or start talking to trade partners about how much this project will cost to build? And maybe there's an innovative solution that hits that performance requirement from the basis of design that we talked about on the last slide. Because really, design build, you should be putting out the performance requirements. And if you're hitting the performance, the efficiency, the life cycle costing, the maintenance, but it's a different solution than what the owner may have been expecting, but it saves them money and they hit their standards or better, great, let's talk about that during design instead of having to go back and forth and do substitution requests and convince an owner that a swap is different. Because always inevitably, if that's happening after the documents are published, then the architect's going to want a change order to go back and change stuff and change the system. And we've already produced all these contract documents with seals on them, and that might be different enough that we actually have to republish or do an addendum or a supplemental instruction, because it might actually be different enough that the inspectors aren't going to let us slide with it. So when we're getting the costing and constructability feedback is actually critical. Schematic design, contractor should be listening. Design development, we want that information coming back from trade partners, coming back from the contractor. When you get into construction documents, that next point, who is the architect of record and who's the engineer of record? That gets very important, especially with the MEP trades, because a lot of times the basis of design that's put out by the mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers is exactly that. It's the performance standards. It's what the owners requested. We all know that not an engineer out there at a design firm ever got the sprinkler pipe routing correct or the duct work the way that the fabricator and the installers want to get it done. So why don't we bring those guys in earlier so we avoid the rework and we get it all done efficiently the first time? There are times in that delivery where the design firm will actually hand over the basis of design documents, and the trade partner will take over not only production of the construction documents, but they also become the engineer of record. There are other times where the agreement is built so that especially the MEP engineers remain the engineer of record, but then you need to set up the system where they are overseeing and managing the trade partners that are actually producing the work. It's pretty sad to say, but out there in the industry, especially in some of the smaller construction companies, people don't understand that the design documents produced by architects and engineers, you don't actually build the building from those. You build the building from shop drawings and fabricator drawings. So get those people involved early, decide who's actually going to draw, decide who's going to be the engineer of record, and then that gets codified in the contract documents, into the actual contracts, and then into the BIM execution plans. That handoff between the designers and the trade partners is crucial to success for design build. If you miss that, it's just going to be a lot of finger pointing all the way down the line. So specifications in the contract documents are going to say what the design build team is going to build. As we said before, the contract document or the contracts, the BIM execution plan, the partnering agreements say how we're going to work. It's a very important qualification or subtlety that really wasn't as poignantly aware in my world until I did hit a design build team that was really functioning as a high performing design build team. So that's, if there's one big thing to take away from this one today, I think that's probably the biggest thing, is decide how you're going to work and then what the team is going to do. So after all that monologue, now I'm getting to the point where the learning objectives that were brought out can actually start to be addressed. The first one that was thrown up was explain the information gathering strategies used by the design build team to inform their design decisions regarding patient comfort, satisfaction, and wellness. Well, you know, a lot of the bigger healthcare networks already have standards. They've got boatloads of standards. They've got all their individual room types. They're all in, you know, PDF files that they're more than happy to send around. They've got all their colors picked out. They know how high their countertops have to be and where the grab bars are going to go, because they've done this over and over. There are other clients, and I referenced the Central Hospital University of Montreal while we were chatting at the beginning, known as SHUM, not CHUM, but SHUM. That project for the Canadian government, they tried to get that project off the ground for 30 years before they finally got that project started in 2009. The client standards that the Canadian government was using, because of their fundamentally different healthcare system, those client standards were 30 years old. We had to work as a design build team to convince the owner to update their model for healthcare delivery, what an exam room should look like in 2009, 2016. I was on that project for 6 years. It was 3 million square feet, 3 buildings, $2 billion. And it was a really interesting process to bring the government and their health ministry up to speed with a better way to deliver healthcare. Hand in hand with the design team, who does that every day, who looks at exam rooms, who looks at surgical suites, who looks at, you know, oncology and infusion suites, hand in hand with us at those meetings, the contractor was present in all of the user group meetings. So as designers, we always typically have a set of user group meetings where we sit down with not just the administrators, but the doctors, the nurses, the clinicians, and we listen to what they want in their kidney dialysis center. You know, what's important to you? We go to the user group meetings, we produce drawings, we bring them back. We typically have 3 rounds of these meetings. The first meeting, we show them what we think is a good idea. They ask for revisions, we listen, we revise drawings, we bring them back. They look at them, and we're always hoping that the second time they go, yeah, that's pretty good, tweak this, tweak this. And we're hoping at the 3rd round, we get clinical sign-on, because we want them to say, yep, that's right. We actually want them to sign a piece of paper, because that's the basis for any changes later if they change their mind, because we're going to start producing documents. Now we're off down the road. And if things start changing, we have to unwind that and do extra work. So we want to make sure we understand those stakeholders' needs, and we want to get clinical sign-on. What I found in real design build partnerships, a lot of the contractors that are out in the market have no understanding of this process that the design team goes through to gather this information. I don't know if they just think the architects sit out there and make this stuff up because we think it would be cool, or we're trying to spend as much money as possible when we produce some documents. But having the contractors sitting in those meetings, listening to the clinicians, understanding what they want and why they want it, has been amazingly helpful, because they can help us solve the problems. They can help the design team understand maybe there's a better way to actually build it and hit that performance standard. But it really does come back to those user groups. On the Shum project in Canada, as I said, very big, very long-term project. We didn't just have 3 rounds of clinical user group meetings. And by the way, the meetings were in French and all the drawings were in metric, so that got really interesting. The clinicians would not sign off. The user group meetings, we just could not wrap them up. And it was because of communication. The client didn't believe that the project we were designing met their needs. The day that we got approval after a year, we brought in a Navisworks model of the dialysis department. So, you know, Navisworks is a really great tool. It's 3-dimensional. Revit is actually a graphic interface on a database. Revit is a crappy drafting tool, but you don't draft in Revit, you model. All those model elements should be 3-dimensional, and they should have a certain level of development that lets you understand the environment you're building. Because you can look at that 3-dimensional graphic interface in Navisworks like a video game, and you can take your little feet and walk through and see what that looks like. After a year of meetings, and with the contractor present, I walked the nurses into the department. I walked down the corridor and we stood at the nurses station and we could pan around and see what the department would look like. Well, it turns out that after a year, what the nurses were really concerned about was that they wouldn't be able to see the patient's faces from the nurse's desk. And because we could show them in a 3-dimensional environment that when you're sitting or standing here, you can see those patients' faces, we got clinical sign-on that day after a year. The contractor, obviously, that our design team was working for was very happy that we finally got contracted, where we finally got clinical sign-on. But at the root of all of it was everybody finally understood why and what the design needed to be to have a satisfied owner. So that was a long road and finally achieved success on that one. But that information gathering early in the process, having that contractor there is critical. All right, so then the constructor's involvement during the design phase, you know, it's a radical thought, but architects don't know everything. So when you're looking at how to maintain uninterrupted hospital functionality, isolating the construction site, making sure that there's good patient experience and patient flow without having to literally endanger people with access to a construction site. That separation, those logistics, and how is the project actually going to be staged and executed? If the contractor can start looking at the design of the project early in the system, there's both the Shum project and the current BJC project I'm on are very tight urban sites, literally 0 laydown area. The one in Canada was 2.5 city blocks and there was 0 laydown area. We had to use the elevator shafts and the stair shafts for tower cranes. We had 5 tower cranes. But the design build team was able to collaborate early in the project, understand where their stairs were going, understands where their concrete structure was going to be going in, and we could start to plan for the site logistics. We ended up closing a road for 2.5 years because we had to have some place to bring in and do the staging and do the execution. And then also phasing of construction was critical. The design build team on the Shum project, the government requirement for the performance standard was they were looking for about a 50-50 split on the phasing of the scope of the project. Our design team, working between the construction company and the design firms, we were actually able to set that up so that in phase 1, They got 85% of their program, not 50. That was the game changer that actually won us the project. We couldn't have done it without the collaboration between the contractor and the design team.
Matt,
Yes, sir.
Can I ask, this Bruce, can I ask a question?
Sure.
You talked about the contractor sitting in the meeting during the design phase as your clients were talking about their needs, the different, I guess, clinical divisions. How does a contractor deal with that? Do they have the skills to deal with that kind of thing? Were they confused? Did you have to explain it to them? How do they work in a professional capacity in a role typically they don't have? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I've seen this range from, I did a project in Arizona that was actually a bid build project, and it was with DPR Construction. And they would send us young project engineers, and the project engineers would sit in the back of the room, and basically they were doing live estimating takeoffs as we were having the meetings, all the way up to some of the engagement from McCarthy on my current project, where we get to higher level or bigger topics, and they may actually pipe in and go, hey, you know, if we put this over here, I can have room to drive some trucks that way. Do we really have to have the setback of the building there? So I would say that it's very dependent on that design build team and getting the right people on that team. There are a lot of ex-architects that work for contractors. There's also a lot of very sharp young project engineers that understand what's going on. And fundamentally, the user group meetings, we know as designers, as architects, that we're talking to doctors and nurses. These are not people that read drawings every day for a living. That's part of the reason to use things like Navisworks or renderings so they can visualize and understand the environment. Contractors are used to reading the plans. They understand what they're seeing up there on the wall. So making sure you've got a team that's open-minded and can be looking at that stuff and participating in that process is absolutely crucial. When I talked about the engagement during the pursuit, I personally, if I'm going to do a significant design build project for the rest of my career, I would love to have written into the contract that both the design team and the construction company have DBIA certified members taking on the project. It should be a requirement. I actually did take my DBIA training with one of the guys from McCarthy that's now the design coordinator for McCarthy on that project. So there's a role right there as a design coordinator that the design builder, the constructor, needs to be able to up their game and manage some of that information and some of that process coming in.
So the follow-up, does that mean that that guy from McCarthy, for instance, did he have more empathy for your decision-making process and therefore be less combative?
Absolutely. The guys from McCarthy have been stunned at how much the architects do during design. They're like, oh my God, you guys have so many meetings. You have to turn around all these drawings in 2 weeks? Really? It's been, I think it's been eye-opening for them. They've told me it's been eye-opening for them to really see what we go through to get to the point where the owner is willing to say, yes, that's what we want to build. Go turn it around the other way. The contractors, the constructors have the opportunity to influence the design to benefit the owner. So the architects should also be listening to the constructor when it comes to some of those logistics, some of those hospital operations, definitely the phasing, to really think through how you can design the project to facilitate that future work. I mean, how many times do you look in the rearview mirror and go, gee, if I built that, 2 feet over that way, I wouldn't have to tear this whole bridge down. I could do this now, leave that in operation, and then once this is fully constructed, then come in and take that down and make the switch overnight or over a weekend. there are places like that where the constructor's involvement during design is absolutely crucial. So how does design build contract documents preserve the early decisions relating to health, safety, and sustainability? Let's go right back to that question that was just asked. It's that empathy, it's that understanding. The contract document production should be different for design build from bid build. The contractors, because they sit in those meetings, they should understand why things are being done. And because they're sitting in those meetings, they can give collaborative input for the best solutions for the owner. And ideally, if they understand that and the architects are understanding what the needs of the contractor are, you know, the brass ring, the real goal is let's avoid value engineering. Let's hit the budget the first time in. And actually, you know, I had it up there before and I didn't actually speak to it. On the DBIA slide, they had 2 of the publications, but there's multiple publications from DBIA. And one of the prevalent deliveries that I've been engaged in is actually a subset of design build called progressive design build. And progressive design build divides the project into part A and part B. Part A services are contracted by the owner through the construction company, through the contractor, and then therefore through the design team. Part A contracts run up through production of a GMP for the job. So you get schematic design and design development. And usually part A ends after design development. So there should be enough information down on paper. The design should be signed off by the owner. The contractor's been there all through the process, and they should have a really good understanding of the job so that their estimators can produce a really solid GMP off a good set of documents. That's part A. When that GMP is presented to the owner and they say, yep, I like the number, I like the design, the project's yours, we're signing off on part B services. That's when you start construction documents and you can start procurement of materials and services from construction subcontractors and trade partners and move into the second part of the job. Part of what I referenced earlier also with the design assist trade partners is they may actually get engaged by the contractor for part A design input services that are not tied to actual construction of the project. So it's back to the BIM execution plan and back to understanding how everybody's going to work. That kind of subtlety of, are we going to hire the metal stud contractor to help us with the partitions during design, or do we just let the architect run with generic partitions because we're going to put it out to bid on the street after the GMP, and then somebody's going to come back with a proprietary stud that lets the designer take, you know, 1 layer, 2 layers of gypboard off, and we're still hitting the same performance for acoustics and stiffness. That's a real example. I've had that happen. It was very painful. You know, you do all this design work, and then all of a sudden all your partitions get skinnier and your drawings are out the window, and now you have to turn around and redraw all the floor plans because all the partitions are the wrong thickness and none of the dimensions work. So if you've got those contracts for part A services out there, and those early decisions are being made with full buy-in from not only owner, but trade partners, contractor, even the interior designers that pick, you know, a 24 by 48 tile to put on the wall, which requires a super stiff metal stud, or they want to do Venetian plaster in the monolithic or the monumental stair. Let's talk about that early. How do we do that the most cost effectively? Or do we do that at all? Do we go to a 24 by 24 tile? In that particular case, would there be that much design difference? Those kind of conversations can save a lot of pain and suffering after construction documents are published and a hard bid comes in and the numbers come in too high. So that collaborative input can give us the best solutions for the owner and keep us moving forward. All right, 4th learning objective. Evaluate the effectiveness of engaging the contractors early in the project for life cycle, developing, maintaining temporary egress paths. Back to my big theme, delivering this project becomes a team effort. The designer should also have more understanding of why things were done by the contractor and the cooperation of the necessities, like, hey, you can't cut off that stairwell in the existing hospital because we still have life safety obligations to meet. We can't shut down, a whole wing of a hospital for 6 months because you guys have a logistics issue. How do we design the projects better early so we don't have to redesign or re-engineer after construction documents are out, after the budgets are already set? That collaborative input earlier in the process is only going to give us better solutions so that the owner can really understand what's going on. I will also qualify this though, that if you do get, and I've been on bad projects where the contractor thinks they can just tell the architect what they're going to do, it's a recipe for disaster. Because if the teams are not respecting each other, if they're not listening to each other, and the worst case scenario is the design team thinks we're going down the road as a collaborative effort. We put out a set of documents at DD. And what I've seen before is sometimes the contractors buy out the project they want to buy out. They don't necessarily buy out the project that the designers drew and the owner signed off on. That's happened on, to varying degrees, a couple of my projects, and it becomes very tricky to negotiate because now, if they didn't buy out what was in the documents, on the back end, we're either doing substitution requests or they're trying to convince the owner that what they bought is just as good as what went in the documents. Where if the team had actually collaborated and we could have put that information in the documents themselves so the owner understood it before there was ink on the signature line, life would have been just so much easier. So it's critical for the project's success, for the egress paths, infection control, the budgets, the logistics, just the satisfaction of the owner, that it really becomes a collaborative process. But creating that culture, creating that collaborative teamwork, that's where the magic is in the design build world. Actually, I think that is my fourth learning point. So in summary, design build actually has different flavors. It has different methodologies. We talked about the engineer of record and the architect of record. We talked about when you're engaging the trade partners. We talked about what services are actually going to be delivered in the BIM execution plan. It's not a one size fits all. There are different ways to do design build, but you do have to start early, and that partnering ideally should be starting during pursuit. And the teams have to reach consensus on how they are going to work. So choose the right delivery that's right for your project, that's going to give you, your designer, your construction company, your manufacturers, your trade partners and suppliers, and ultimately your owner, what's going to be the best way to get them their project. But you've got to communicate and you've got to collaborate to reach that goal. Are there other questions out there? I've been monologuing for 45 minutes now. So, Bruce, it looks like you have your hand up.
Well, that was from me. That was from before, but I'll ask another question.
Okay, hit me.
Okay, what happens when you have a product failure? Once you have a product failure, obviously the architect can be sued in a round robin suit, but does that make the contractor more responsible for product selection?
So here's the thing about design build that was like the epiphany for me. I had never heard of the Spearin doctrine before. Do you all know what the Spearin doctrine is? The Spearman Doctrine was a case in the early 1900s where an architect was engaged by the US military to design a facility. And they produced the documents, they were given to the owner. The owner bought out the work from a general construction company, and then things failed. And the suit where the construction company sued the government because the drawings were wrong is the Spearman case. So, but keep in mind what happened. The contractor had to sue the owner because the owner had hired the the design team. So I learned all this in the DBIA training, and it was magical. The third day of the training was actually all 8 hours was taught by a lawyer, and it was actually my favorite day. So in the design build relationship, there is no relationship between the owner and the architect or the mechanical plumbing engineers. The owner hires the construction company. So if the designer gets the drawings wrong and there's a product that we specify or there's some failure in the design and the owner isn't happy, the owner sues the construction company, and the construction company then sues the design team for breach of contract because our contract says we're going to give you standard of care. So I did not, that's the general theme. I did not do that justice. I would encourage you to take the DBIA training and learn all that. But it's a different relationship. And that's one of the trickiest things when the constructor thinks they can tell the designer what to put in the building. And the designer is saying, no, the owner requirement's this, I'm putting this in. And then they buy out something different than what we drew. That same premise, as always, if the designer puts out drawings and the contractor doesn't build what's on the drawings, the contractor's on their own. That premise still holds. But the owner doesn't have a contract relationship with the designer. They now have a contract relationship with the constructor. And if there's a problem with the drawings, the constructor has to go after the designer. It's fundamentally different.
Matt, I would say this to you. The reason you didn't learn about the Spearman Doctrine before you went to DBI training was you didn't talk to one of your wise spec writers at Canon, because that's very, very well known to us.
But I sure tell you, George, they didn't teach me that at University of Kansas 30 years ago.
No, it's something that we all learned the hard way.
Yep.
So Matt, I got a question for you. When I was working with you before, we had talked about PPDs quite a bit.
Yes.
Have you been using that with the new project, and has it been successful, or?
We are using those. I honestly think the PPD is an amazing tool. So, the preliminary project description as a format for what everyone used to call a project narrative, I think is an amazing document. I've never actually had both a contractor and an owner give us a compliment on the project narrative. They're like, hey, this is great. And I was stunned. But this is the third project that I've used the preliminary project description on. The organization, the clarity, the description of the systems going in the building instead of the elements going in the building, I think really engenders understanding, and it really helps. The estimators actually like them. Mm-hmm. So they're wonderful.
That's what we found is when we do PPDs, or we call them SPDs, system performance descriptions, the getting the estimators and the owners and the contractors involved very early helps alleviate change orders and RFIs.
And it's a whole lot easier to put that down in writing and have somebody actually read it, but they have to read it because
right.
we just can't draw that fast to get that amount of information down on paper. And I got to say, it also does help when you're doing work at an established hospital where you're meeting standards. So you can go walk through the last building they drew or the last building they built and take a look at it and understand what the levels of finish is and the level of quality that owner is looking for.
When you were talking about the Revit or the BIM execution plan, is that sort of similar to the level of development plan?
That's a component of the BIM execution plan.
Can you describe the BIM execution plan?
So it's been really interesting to get further down the road because, you know, there's level of development, which you actually go to the BIM, national BIM standard, and it says, okay, you know, level 100 through level 500. And designers, architects, engineers really should be stopping at level 200, maybe level 300, because we're only going to draw, you know, the mullion system as a profile. We're not going to draw the actual aluminum extrusion and where the glass is and where the weeps are. We're not designing to that level. So I would encourage you to go look at the national BIM standard for some really good examples of level 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. By the time you get to level 400 and 500, that really should be almost fabricator level drawings that you don't want the design team to mess with, because that's not what we're good at. But level of development of how detailed are you going to draw it, that basis of design can get documented at level 200, level 300. That's typically what architects are responsible for, and that's what we want to put our seal on and take liability for. Then you cross over into the shop drawings and the other stuff. But I think one of the other components there's many other components in the BIM execution plan. One of the main ones is when is that going to happen? Not only who is going to draw it to the level where you're getting a permit, but who is drawing the shop drawings. It's when are they doing it? Are they actually helping produce construction documents during design? I've had projects where the mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers actually stop working at DD, and then the trade partners pick up and they produce the construction documents and they put their seals on the documents. So they're in effect, they're becoming part of the design team, working for the contractor, not for the architect, because they are a trade partner that has engineering and is going to seal those documents. So there's what you're drawing, there's who's drawing it, and there's when you're drawing it. So the last BIM execution plan we did actually included a calendar, and the calendar based on the phase of the job said when people were plugging in to draw to that typical level of development conversation that people are more aware of than they used to be.
Matt, when we were doing the write-up for this program, one of the things I came across was that we're approaching almost half of the projects in this country being done design build. Are you getting the sense that half of the projects that you're seeing these days are design build or no?
I'm absolutely seeing that. I tend to work on large projects. So I've been with Canon Design for 11 and a half years now. And realistically, in the last 11 years, I've worked on 6 projects. And 3 out of the 6 in the last 11 years were design build. But I know, you know, there's not many people spend 6 years on one single $2 billion project. That's a little off the curve. So I probably have a biased point of view.
Hey, Matt, I am actually an architect at a design build firm. But while you do $2 billion projects, I'm doing $2 million projects. So world of difference, but the thought and the concepts ring true throughout. So I want to say just fantastic. And I will also speak to George's question. I've been doing design build almost exclusively for the last 20 years. And I just know everyone I'm talking to, especially on the construction side, they're liking more of that because it puts them in, they have a little more control over their own fate, as opposed to just relying on the drawings that they get, the documents that they get that are frequently don't have some very practical considerations involved. And being able to be a part of that, I think there's actually an empathy thing that's happening as well. Cross-pollinating, we're actually learning that each other's job is way more difficult than we ever could have imagined. And I think we're learning how to communicate and work better as a result too. So fantastic job. I love this tonight. So
thank you.
And we have a question in the chat from Catherine Bazoyan. Do you require a release of the BIM model in the DB process with other consultants and contractors? And if so, when do you request the release be signed?
So that's definitely part of the BIM execution plan. The AIA has the E203 and there's two more, but I can't remember the numbers. And then it's also baked into the cake in the DBIA stuff as well. But, you know, back in the day, the first real time I ever did a Revit project in 2009, I remember having to take the DVD with the file and hand it to the owner, and the owner just took it and handed it to the contractor. But I was contracted to the owner and I had to deliver it to the owner. And that's different in design build. We're contracted to the construction company. And now typically, like most of our big projects now are running on Autodesk BIM 360. So the files are hosted on a BIM 360 site that the contractor's paying for, and we're putting our stuff up there live all the time. The models live on that server, and we just work on them from our office. And that's when you really start getting the different trade partners working in the same live environment, and you can start to really leverage that power of Revit and BIM. So those have to be discussed before SD even starts to understand how you're going to do that work.
Yeah, I remember one of the big things, one of the big topics when BIM first started was who owns the BIM model. And it sounds like we're coming to the point where everyone does, right? I mean, is that kind of the concept now?
You know, it's absolutely very collaborative. And, you know, I'm very sensitive to what am I putting my seal on? So architects tend to be a little different than the engineers, because in engineering, yeah, the mechanical ductwork guys may take over the ductwork and they may put a seal on that drawing that gets submitted for permit, but we're not seeing that yet in the architectural world. You know, Dietrich is not going to seal a set of floor plans just because they make metal studs. That's not their wheelhouse. So as far as the ownership of the architectural model, the architects really still control that one. And that's why that AOR, EOR conversation early is still very critical. So I may put our model up there on BIM 360, but I sure as hell don't want anybody changing it unless I know exactly what they're doing, because my seal's going on it.
So basically what you're saying is everyone owns their own part of it. Right?
Yes. Yep.
I don't see anything else in the chat other than people saying thank you. Does anyone else have a live question?
Okay. Well, it looks like we're down to just the congratulations and the thanks, and so I'll add ours to that too, Matt. Thank you very much for the presentation tonight. Good presentation. You know, I think a number of us have been involved in different ways with the design build, and you know, I think, you know, as you said, it's starting to it's seeing a lot more activity out there, you know, depending on the client. I guess one question I was going to ask, do you see this as something more for a experienced client or for a, you know, a client that may not have an experienced construction staff or facility staff?
To some degree, I think it's easier if the owner understands construction. But if they don't, it's the responsibility of the design team and the contractor to actually explain it. Because, you know, at the end of the day, if they're experienced or not, they're going to know if they don't like what they got. And then that's not good for anybody.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, once again, thanks a lot to everyone. Hope to see you in April for a session on touchless elevators. So everyone, thanks a lot. Be safe out there. Have a good time. Take care, everybody.